Welcome to Beyond the Box, a space for embracing radical possibility and collective resilience. This podcast is for leaders and thinkers who are interested in transforming their communities, organizations, or industries. My goal is to get us to think about how we can embrace new ways of thinking about ourselves, each other, and the world. As an organizational development consultant, I am passionate about collective change, collective imagination, co-creation, and especially collective resilience. I see resilience as a shared resource. So where it has been researched and talked about as an individual trait, as something that someone either has or doesn't have, I see it as something that is experienced through relationships. I talked about this in a previous podcast episode. I talked about social facilitation. Social facilitation is a phenomenon that has been studied in social psychology. You can be watching a show with someone and the emotions that you experience with that person are intensified, magnified, just because of that person's presence. You laugh harder. The jokes seem funnier. There was a study that involved asking participants to guess how long it would take for them to walk up a hill. And those who were asked to estimate how long it would take for them to walk up that hill by themselves said that it would take them longer than those who had been asked to imagine that they would be walking up that hill with a close friend. This is the power of the presence of another human being. Knowing that someone is beside us signals to our brains that we are more capable. The research hasn't explicitly tied resilience to social support. But when looking at resilience in specific contexts, there's research showing a correlation between social support and a person's ability to recover and thrive. But when looking at resilience as an independent construct, it is very often studied in isolation. I've been excited recently to develop a measure of resilience, actually something that looks at predictors of resilience in organizational settings. And what I'm doing is looking at specifically predictors of resilience at 3 levels, the individual, social, and structural levels, to see how interactions among those 3 levels influence employee resilience. I'm so excited about that because depending on what the outcome of that research is, I would love to apply that to different contexts. My sense is that those findings would apply to different settings, that they would be generalizable. And of course, that remains to be seen. And I think intuitively, we have a hunch that, yeah, of course, a multi-level analysis is useful. I think maybe we assume, maybe it's implied, but I just love the idea of making this more explicit in the research. So I'm really excited about that. And so I wanted to share a little bit about, just talk a little bit more about that in today's podcast episode. I wanted to talk about what my thoughts are, specifically just linking emotional intelligence to resilience, and not going to make it overly academic. I'm just going to make it more accessible. So I want to talk about, how I conceptualize it and make it very tangible. My goal is for you to walk away with some tools, some ways of really incorporating practices for enhancing your own resilience, or maybe working with others, maybe working with team members, or maybe you're a parent and you want to work with your children to help them develop their emotional intelligence so that they can be a little bit more resilient. There are no shortage of opportunities to strengthen our own EQ or to support others in strengthening their EQ so that they can become more resilient. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. With that being said, I think it's important to talk about what an emotion is. And we'll distinguish emotions from feelings because I think that's important too. We'll get there in a second. But the word emotion is derived from the Latin verb emovere, E-M-O-V-E-R-E, which means to move, literally means to move. And so emotions are purposeful and that they are meant to facilitate action. Emotions serve a purpose. They're purposeful. They are meant to facilitate action. So they're not bad. It's about how you leverage them. In the same way that I do not view resilience as a trait that you either have or don't have, same thing with emotional intelligence. The average person can develop emotional intelligence. It can be cultivated. None of these things occur in a vacuum. In the same way that I don't believe that resilience occurs in a vacuum, neither does EQ, because none of us grow and develop in a vacuum. So with that being said, there are 4 practices that I think make someone emotionally intelligent. Based on my own practice as an emotional intelligence consultant, I am very much immersed in the literature. I'm very familiar with different models of EQ, from the MSCEIT to the EQI. Anything that I share will be research-backed for sure. At the same time, I'm always going to incorporate my lived experience and embodied wisdom into anything and everything that I share, because it's important for me to lead with authenticity in everything that I do. So here are 4 practices that I've distilled from the research and synthesizing all of it, and I hope it's helpful. The first is awareness. It's like, I always say, it's the gateway skill or the gateway practice. It's like the fundamental skill. It's noticing your emotional patterns. Noticing your reactions is not the same as emotional awareness. Some people are very reactive. They're aware of their reactions, but they're not actually emotionally aware. Emotionally self-aware people are aware of their emotional patterns. They're aware of how their emotions influence their behaviors and decisions. They notice that when this thing happens, I tend to react this way, which then influences me to behave this way or to speak this way. So they're able to start putting the pieces together. They're not externalizing their behavior. Someone who lacks emotional awareness says, "You made me angry." They tend to blame external events for how they feel. They tend to say things like, "If you didn't do this, I wouldn't feel this way." Whereas emotionally aware people are able to take ownership. They don't say things like "you." So if someone says, "Hey, I noticed that you're coming across a little bit tense right now," the person who's emotionally aware goes, "Yeah, you know what? I'm feeling a little threatened by this conversation. I'm feeling a little irritated. I'm feeling a little anxious. I'm feeling a little sad." They're using I statements. The person who lacks emotional awareness says, "Yeah, well, you said you're not being you." That's not emotional awareness. So there's a big difference here. Okay. So the person who is emotionally self-aware is very clear about how their emotions are influencing their decisions, their actions, their goals, and their motivation as well. Because there's a connection between emotions and motivation. Okay. Motivation for the procrastinators out there, procrastination is less about time management and more about, nearly all about, your emotions. Okay, so there's a huge connection between like anxiety and procrastination. Emotionally self-aware people are able to leverage emotional information to motivate themselves or to understand what the emotional blockers are when it comes to what is demotivating them. So when you are experiencing a hardship, when you're navigating that setback, you need to be aware of how that hardship is impacting you on an emotional level, because your ability to set goals for yourself in the situation is going to be shaped by your emotional patterns and your ability to recognize how your emotions are influencing you in the situation. So emotional awareness is very important. So practicing emotional awareness is key, is the first step. The second practice is emotional filtering. Once you become aware, like I'm noticing the presence of anger here, filtering is your ability to distinguish signal from noise, or like what's meaningful here and what's a distraction. Your emotions are physiological reactions to the environment. So, for example, someone says something to you, they said it in a tone of voice that feels a little threatening. You feel a little bit guarded, like, hold on, am I safe in this interaction? So there's a little bit of like mild irritation because the person spoke to you in a tone that conveyed disrespect, right? So now you're like, hold up. Do I need to assert a boundary here? You noticed the presence of irritation within you. There's internal data that is informing how you respond. That's important. That's an emotion. Emotions are very quick. They have a short lifespan, like for the average person, like maybe 90 seconds. Again, they're purposeful. They're meant to facilitate action. Your brain is forming an action plan. Do I need to withdraw? Do I need to confront something? What do I need to do? That's very different from a feeling. A feeling is the next layer. A feeling is when we now start interpreting the situation and we layer it with a story. Some people, they immediately start layering the emotion with a story. Oh my God, who does she think she is? Why would she talk to me like that? Oh, and then they start texting, they call a friend. Let me tell you, oh my gosh, let me tell you, she just said this. And what happens is the emotion never really gets utilized and channeled the way that it could have been, where it was internal data signaling to you that there's a need potentially. Okay. So it was signaling to you that you have a need to be respected in your interactions. That need never really gets addressed in a way that is helpful or constructive. You also have a need for relationships that are harmonious. Okay, you have a need for egalitarianism in your friendships. That also never gets addressed, right? So there are all of these constructive things that you could have, leveraged your emotions to kind of help you with, that never gets addressed because now you're layering that emotion with all this story. Some people never get past this filtering stage because what happens is they layer the emotion with all kinds of noise. There's all this noise that gets piled on top of the emotion. And so they never get to the third stage. The third stage is where the actual regulation or management stage takes place. So the first two stages, emotional awareness, is again being able to recognize your emotional patterns, right? How does this relate to this? Noticing there's the presence of this emotion here, being able to recognize it, being aware of it. The second is being able to filter or discern or distill the difference between an actual emotional response to an in the moment situation from a trigger, a story, something that you have projected from the past onto the present moment. So being able to distill signal from all the noise and the distractions. So there's that filtering process. So that's the second practice. The third is being able to regulate or manage your emotions effectively. So let's say you have navigated that filtering stage effectively. You were irritated. You recognized the irritation. This person spoke to you in a way that conveyed disrespect. You're like, I don't like how that sounded. Now you can go to the regulation stage. Now, when they talk about emotion regulation in the literature, there are two strategies. There's the suppression strategy, which is not very effective. This is where you just brush it off and say, whatever, I'm just going to ignore it. That's not effective. The more effective strategy is what they call a reappraisal strategy, requiring emotional flexibility and cognitive flexibility. Okay, so it requires both emotional and cognitive flexibility. I want you to think about flexibility as requiring this dynamic tension. That is what's required when we're talking about emotional flexibility and cognitive flexibility here, where there's a tension in allowing yourself to expand your emotional range as well as your cognitive range. What I'm saying here is it's not necessarily going to feel comfortable to exercise this flexibility. There's going to be some tension. The goal, however, is not to bypass what you're feeling. It's not to ignore what you're feeling or convince yourself to feel the opposite. So you're not trying to tell yourself, oh, you know what? I shouldn't feel irritated. That's my friend. Well, I shouldn't feel that way. She didn't mean it that way. Don't do that. What you resist persists. That's just a form of suppression. Don't suppress what you feel. Hold space for what you feel while exploring the tension of the opposite. There's a dynamic tension here. You're not ignoring what you feel. You're holding space for the both and. So there's that dialectic of, I feel that there was some disrespect in what this person said, and let me consider alternative perspectives. So it's not an either or, it's both and. So there's a dynamic tension here. The dynamic tension allows you to expand your range. Okay, you're not choosing either or. You want space for all of it because it's having an expanded range of perspectives and emotions that allows you to navigate complexity and hardship much more effectively than having only a very limited range of emotional responses and perspectives. It's flexibility that makes people more adaptive and more capable of responding to challenges because they have a wider range of tools to pull from when responding to challenges. So in the example that I gave, it's like, that person spoke to me in a way that conveyed disrespect, and I didn't like that. At the same time, there are times that I've probably come across like that to people as well, and I didn't really mean anything by it. I was having a hard day. Maybe I don't have to take it personal. So in this example, I'm not negating how I felt, and I'm not convincing myself that they weren't being disrespectful. Instead, I'm acknowledging that how I felt was valid and that, yeah, I'm not crazy. If they spoke to me crazy, if they came out the side of their neck, okay? Like, I'm not going to sit here and gaslight myself. At the same time, maybe I can depersonalize it. And that's the flexibility that we're talking about. And that's that reappraisal strategy that can offer us a more expanded range of responses where I don't have to sit here and gaslight myself or pretend that I wasn't offended. When we talk about regulation, we often think about regulation in terms of control meaning rigid structures or limited range of movement. But I want you to think about control in terms of the control that is exhibited in the tension you feel when you're stretching. You have to control the tension. You have to kind of control the extent to which you lean forward. When you're sitting and you have your legs outstretched, you're leaning forward, kind of doing that hamstring stretch, and you're trying to touch your toes. That's controlled movement that's required of you. There's a control, but there's also a softening too. Right? You're controlling the amount of tension that you are experiencing as you lean forward. You don't want to overdo it. And so you get to play around with with the degree of tension that you can handle or you can manage as you reorient yourself in the situation or you reframe the situation in a way that works for you without invalidating your experience and without gaslighting yourself or pretending you didn't feel how you felt. And that is very different from the advice out there where people are like, just, slap on a happy face. Come on, it didn't get to you. Come on, pretend. Don't do that to yourself. If you're angry, you're angry. If you're sad, you're sad. If you're afraid, you're afraid. Don't think you can trick yourself out of feeling any of the things that you feel. It comes back around. It finds its way back to you. You cannot outsmart your body. It responds the way it responds. It's an automatic subconscious thing. Now, yes, are there distortions? Are there emotional distortions and biases? Absolutely. As you get better at identifying all that noise, then, you'll be better able to navigate those things, but once you get past that and you can validate, that you are responding to a real-time violation, that someone really said something crazy to you. I sound passionate about this because for a long time, I let people get away with just violating my boundaries, friends, partner. I have very high cognitive flexibility, like super high. I can look at things from like any perspective. I can argue both sides of any any situation. And I have extraordinarily high empathy, both cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. It has gotten me into a lot of trouble over the years. I can laugh about it now, but it really wasn't funny for a long time. And for a long time, I had a really hard time, that filtering stage was a challenge for me because I was like, wait, should I be angry? I would overanalyze my emotions. I would spend more time analyzing what I was, whatever emotion would come up, I would just analyze it to death. And then weeks later, all of that anger would just come to the surface and I would be enraged. I would be furious and there would be nothing I could do about it. I couldn't address it anymore because the situation had passed. And then I'd be stewing and ruminating like, if only I had just, punched that person. No, but I'm just kidding. But, but not really. But, I was like, I should have, so I had to learn, hindsight is 2020, but I had to learn the hard way to pay more attention to what I was feeling in the moment, to what emotions were arising in the moment. So I say all that to say, don't ignore what emotions are coming up for you. People tend to think that not experiencing emotions is some kind of like if you don't experience emotions, you're somehow superior to people who do. And I would say it's more about how adept you are at noticing, filtering, and managing or leveraging your emotions effectively. And these are not things that we're taught. These are things that many of us are learning as we go. So be gracious with yourself. The fourth practice is facilitation. And this circles back to the very definition of emotions, which is, again, emotion is derived from the Latin verb emovere, which means to move. Emotions are purposeful and that they are meant to facilitate action. Once you have practiced noticing your emotions, distilling them from all the noise, all the triggers, all the biases and distortions, you've practiced reorienting yourself in the situation so that you are positioned to respond effectively. Now you can channel that emotion constructively. So emotional facilitation is about the constructive use or expression of that emotional energy. And now you can act. Now you are positioned to act. And that's what emotional facilitation is all about. And acting could be writing a poem, writing a letter, pulling someone to the side, having a conversation. It could be starting a movement. It could be writing a blog. It could be writing a book. It could be deciding to go for a run. Whatever it is, you are now taking appropriate action or constructive action to channel or move that energy. So how does this tie into resilience? When you're navigating a challenge, the ability to harness uncomfortable emotions in a way that helps you grow and be strengthened rather than diminished or debilitated by that hardship is largely dependent on these practices. And I say largely because these practices don't occur in a vacuum. And this circles back to what I shared earlier about my research on resilience. We don't develop in isolation. We don't live in a vacuum. Everything that we do, we are inextricably connected to one another. And so it's important that we consider not only how cultivating our EQ individually can help us be more resilient, but I want you to consider how being more emotionally intelligent enables you to better support others who are going through hardships. Or as an organizational leader, think about how cultivating your emotional intelligence makes you better able to support your team members or those you lead when they're experiencing challenges. With that being said, this was a very different episode because I decided to go off script. I decided to just speak more authentically from the heart. Let me know what you thought. If you want me to go back on script, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, if you preferred this format, I'll just keep this up. And let me know which practice you would like to strengthen. For me, personally, the one I've been leaning into more is facilitation. I spent a lot of time working on that filtering one, like I said before, because I was like really like overanalyzing every emotion for a very long time. The one I've been leaning into is really channeling my emotions into constructive action. I should share that this podcast is an example of emotional facilitation, as is my research on resilience. I'll maybe share more about that in a later episode. But anyway, thank you for being here. Look forward to your feedback. If you have any questions or any comments, feel free to email me at tamara@livebeyondthebox.com. If you're interested in coaching or consulting, feel free to email me there as well. Until next time, take care.